I watched $22,000 worth of winter stockpile burn to ash while 4 HOA board members stood there grinning like they'd just hit the lottery. That was survival supplies for my 78-year-old mother with dementia to get through Colorado's brutal winters. Cheryl Kensington and her crew called it emergency cleanup. What Cheryl didn't know, my grandfather's 1962 property deed gave us exclusive control over the Pine Valley Spillway, and I was about to turn their luxury lakefront mansions into very expensive indoor swimming pools. What would you do if corrupt HOA officials destroyed your family's survival supplies? Because I'm about to show you exactly how mountain justice works. Drop your state below. I want to know how many of you are dealing with HOA tyrants, because this revenge story is for everyone who's ever been crushed by petty bureaucrats with clipboards. My name's Wade Garrison, and at 52, I thought I'd seen every kind of bureaucratic nonsense you could imagine. 20 years running heavy equipment taught me that preparation saves lives, especially when you're caring for someone who depends on you completely. My mother Sarah has dementia, and in the Colorado Rockies, being unprepared isn't just inconvenient, it's deadly. Pine Valley sits at 8,000 feet, where winters don't mess around. We're talking 6 months of potential isolation, with blizzards that can dump 4 feet of snow overnight and temperatures that'll freeze your pipes before you finish your morning coffee. I start winter prep in August because when the first storm hits in October, there's no running to the store. You either have what you need or you don't. The community was built in 1985 around an artificial lake that used to be part of my family's ranch. My grandfather was smart enough to retain the water rights when he sold the land to developers. Most folks in Pine Valley have no clue that the lake they pay HOA fees to maintain is actually controlled by the guy living in the eyesore property they complain about. That's where Cheryl Kensington comes in. Picture your worst nightmare of a HOA president, fake smile, designer clothes that cost more than most people's cars, and the kind of passive-aggressive sweetness that makes your skin crawl. She moved here 3 years ago with her little gang of luxury homeowners who treat the community like their personal country club. Trevor Ashworth, the vice president, flips houses for a living and owns the $850,000 mansion with the illegally oversized heated pool. Marissa Vale runs the treasurer position from her $920,000 mountain retreat that she rents out to rich tourists. And Douglas Whitfield, the secretary, manages vacation rentals from his $780,000 lakefront property. All 4 of them live in houses that shouldn't exist according to the original flood zone maps, but we'll get to that later. The thing about caring for someone with dementia is routine becomes everything. My mother knows where her medications are stored, recognizes the labeled containers I've used for 15 years, and feels secure when she can see our supplies organized exactly the same way every winter. Destroying that routine isn't just cruel, it's dangerous. October 23rd changed everything. I had to drive Mom to Denver for her quarterly neurologist appointment, a 6-hour round trip that couldn't be postponed. The appointment went well, her medications were adjusted, and we even stopped for her favorite ice cream on the way home. I remember thinking it was one of the good days, you know? The kind where dementia takes a back seat and you get glimpses of the person she used to be. We pulled into our driveway at 4:30 p.m. to find 4 expensive cars parked in front of our house and smoke rising from our backyard. The acrid smell of melting plastic hit us immediately, followed by the chemical stench of burning medical supplies. I could hear my mother starting to cry before she even saw what had happened, because that smell meant her security was literally going up in smoke. Cheryl stood there in her $3,000 coat, clipboard in hand, supervising the destruction of everything we'd spent months preparing. 6 months worth of canned food, propane for backup heat, generator fuel, firewood, medical supplies, emergency water, $22,000 worth of careful planning reduced to ash and melted plastic. Emergency fire hazard cleanup, she announced with that fake sweet smile. We received reports of unsafe storage conditions. Reports from who? The nearest neighbor is 200 yards away, and old Bill Henderson has been watching my back since I was 12 years old. The only people who could see into our storage area were the board members whose houses sit on the illegal lakefront lots. "Where's your notice?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady while watching propane tanks pop in the flames and my mother's diabetes supplies melt into toxic puddles. "Posted on your door this morning," Trevor said, not even trying to hide his smirk. 72-hour notice for emergency abatement. Except we left at 6 a.m. for the Denver appointment, and there was no notice on our door when we left. But pointing that out wouldn't bring back the supplies. And with the first blizzard forecast for 3 days later, arguing was a luxury I couldn't afford. The Colorado Mountain Rule is simple. You need 72 hours of emergency supplies minimum, but smart folks keep 6 months worth because isolation up here isn't a maybe, it's a guarantee. What Cheryl and her crew had just destroyed represented the difference between surviving winter and becoming a cautionary tale. But standing there, watching my preparation burn while my mother cried about her lost medicine boxes, I remembered something my grandfather taught me about water rights and patience. Sometimes the best revenge is the kind that looks like an act of God. The next morning brought the first wave of coordinated attacks. I should have seen it coming, but I underestimated just how organized these people were. 4 separate envelopes arrived by certified mail, each from a different government agency, each with a different board member's signature as the concerned citizen who'd filed the complaint. Cheryl hit me with the health department. Apparently my bulk food storage violated some obscure regulation about residential food service preparation. The fine started at $5,000 and increased by $500 daily until compliance. Trevor went after my propane system through the fire marshal, claiming my backup heating setup was a neighborhood explosion risk. Marissa targeted my generator installation through building code enforcement, suddenly discovering that my grandfather's 40-year-old electrical work needed modern permits. And Douglas, the vacation rental expert, filed environmental complaints about my fuel storage containers. The total potential fines? $35,000 with daily penalties that would bankrupt me before Christmas. But here's the thing about bureaucratic warfare, it works both ways. 20 years of dealing with city inspectors and code enforcement taught me that people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw regulatory stones. While they were busy filing complaints about my winter prep, I was researching their properties at the county courthouse. You know what I found in those dusty deed books? Pure gold. Trevor's mansion with the heated pool. His propane system is 3 times larger than mine, installed without permits to heat 8,000 square feet of pure ego. Cheryl's wine cellar requires a backup generator that makes mine look like a toy. And guess what? No electrical permits on file. Marissa's mountain retreat has fuel storage for her rental business that dwarfs my personal winter supply, all installed without environmental impact studies. But the real treasure was buried in the original 1985 development papers. My family didn't just sell land to create Pine Valley. We retained specific water rights that most people forgot about decades ago. The spillway that controls lake levels, that's not community property, that's Garrison family property operated under exclusive rights that predate every single one of their luxury homes. I spent 3 days in the courthouse basement breathing dust and reading property law, while outside my window the first snow started falling. Each page I turned revealed another layer of their hypocrisy, another violation they were guilty of, another piece of leverage I'd need for what was coming. The mini twist came when I discovered something that made me laugh out loud in that silent courthouse basement. Every single one of their complaints against my property cited the exact same violations their own homes were guilty of. Trevor's complaint about my propane storage, his system violates 3 separate fire codes. Cheryl's health department filing, her vacation rental kitchen operates without proper permits. It was like watching criminals complain about jaywalking while robbing a bank. Property rights law is fascinating once you dig into it. Here's what most people don't know. Original landowners retain specific usage rights unless those rights are explicitly transferred in writing. Translation: just because someone builds a community around your land doesn't mean you lose the rights your family negotiated decades ago. My mother spent those 3 days asking where her medicine boxes went, getting more agitated each time I had to explain that they were gone. Dementia makes change terrifying, and watching her routine destroyed was almost as infuriating as the legal attacks. But every time she asked about her missing supplies, I remembered that spillway control panel in our basement and smiled just a little. The temperature dropped to 15 degrees that first week, and I watched my neighbors turn up their thermostats while I rationed our remaining propane. 3 families drove past our house every day, but nobody stopped to check on the elderly woman whose medicine they'd helped destroy. That's when I realized this wasn't just about property values or community standards. This was about power, and the kind of people who enjoy wielding it against those who can't fight back. At least that's what they thought. By November, Cheryl and her board had escalated from bureaucratic warfare to full-scale character assassination. The neighborhood suddenly developed a collective case of amnesia about 15 years of good relations with the Garrisons. Overnight, I went from Wade, who fixes everyone's plumbing for free, to that dangerous hoarder who threatens community safety. The Whisper campaign was masterfully orchestrated. Cheryl organized a community safety meeting where she presented a slideshow of my destroyed stockpile, carefully photographed to look as threatening as possible. Propane tanks became explosive devices. Canned food storage became unsanitary hoarding conditions. My generator setup became unlicensed electrical hazards. Within a week, I couldn't buy supplies anywhere in town. The hardware store owner who'd known me since high school apologetically explained that several customers had expressed concerns about selling me dangerous materials. The pharmacy where my mother had filled prescriptions for 10 years suddenly required additional verification for her medications. Even the grocery store started treating me like I might detonate in the cereal aisle. The isolation was strategic and effective. When you live an hour from the nearest city, losing local supplier relationships isn't just inconvenient, it's potentially life-threatening. My mother's home health aide quit after receiving anonymous tips about unsafe working conditions. Neighbors who used to wave from their driveways started crossing the street to avoid eye contact. But every mile I drove to find supplies, every hostile look from former friends, every night I watched my mother ask why people weren't talking to us anymore. I spent thinking about water rights and spring flooding patterns. I started researching the board's real estate activities, using public records that anyone can access if they know where to look. What I found was a pattern that made my blood boil and my lawyer's eyes light up like Christmas morning. Over the past 3 years, 6 elderly or disabled residents had been forced to sell their properties after facing compliance issues with the HOA. Each time, the same pattern emerged. Coordinated complaints, escalating fines, social isolation, and finally a generous buyout offer from a shell company called Pine Valley Properties, LLC. Guess who the managing partners of Pine Valley Properties turned out to be? If you guessed Cheryl, Trevor, Marissa, and Douglas, you win the prize. They weren't just harassing residents, they were running a systematic land grab operation, targeting vulnerable community members and forcing below-market sales. The mini twist that changed everything happened when I contacted the families who'd been forced out. Mrs. Patterson, who'd sold her house after facing health code violations for her diabetic supplies. Mr. Rodriguez, forced out over fire hazards related to his wood-burning stove. The Williams family, elderly couple who sold after zoning violations about their vegetable garden. Every single case followed the same script Cheryl was using on me. Every family had been isolated, harassed, and financially pressured until selling seemed like the only option. And every property had been purchased by Pine Valley Properties at 30 to 40% below market value, then flipped to wealthy buyers looking for mountain retreats. I spent December building a case file that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Bank records showing the board's coordination, property transfers revealing the profit margins, complaint patterns demonstrating the systematic targeting. But the real gold mine was what I discovered about their exit strategy. All 4 board members had Hawaii vacation rentals booked from December through March. Not just vacation rentals, long-term leases that covered the entire winter season. While they were destroying my family's winter preparation, they were planning to abandon the community entirely during the harshest months. Their homes sat empty through January and February, with minimal heating and 0 emergency supplies. These people lecturing me about community safety had left Pine Valley looking like a ghost town, with automated systems maintaining their luxury homes while year-round residents struggled through blizzards and power outages. The irony was perfect. They'd destroyed my winter stockpile while having 0 winter preparation themselves. They relied entirely on wealth and escape routes, never considering that someone might control resources they'd forgotten about. Real estate fraud investigations follow predictable patterns, and systematic targeting of vulnerable residents raises immediate red flags with federal authorities. Translation: when you can prove coordinated conspiracy to defraud elderly residents, you're not just looking at civil lawsuits anymore. By February, I had documentation that could destroy their little empire, but documentation is just paper until you have the leverage to use it. Fortunately, I was sitting on 40 years' worth of leverage that controlled every drop of water in their artificial paradise. My mother's condition stabilized once I established new medication routines, but she never stopped asking about her lost medicine boxes. Every question reminded me that this wasn't just about property rights or money. It was about justice for people who couldn't fight back against systematic abuse. March brought the board's final overreach, the kind of desperate power play that reveals exactly what people are willing to do when they think they're untouchable. With their Hawaii tans still fresh and their luxury homes showing signs of minimal winter maintenance, Cheryl and company filed for emergency property seizure. The petition was a masterpiece of bureaucratic manipulation, claiming that my inability to maintain safe winter conditions endangered both my mother and the broader community. They painted me as a mentally unstable hoarder who posed an imminent threat during spring melt season, when his obsessive weather monitoring and erratic property modifications could endanger downstream residents. Translation: they wanted my land, and they were willing to destroy an elderly woman's life to get it. Adult Protective Services arrived on a Thursday morning with a social worker who looked genuinely concerned about my mother's welfare. I can't blame her. She was doing her job, responding to what appeared to be legitimate safety concerns about an elderly woman living with someone the community considered dangerous. "Can you provide adequate care during emergency conditions?" she asked, taking notes while my mother sat confused in her favorite chair, wondering why strangers were asking about taking our house. "Ma'am, I've been caring for this land and this family for 52 years, I replied, keeping my voice steady while rage burned in my chest. "We've survived blizzards that would terrify most people, and we'll survive whatever comes next." But privately, I knew the hearing was scheduled for March 15th, right in the middle of spring melt season. If I lost property control, my 40 years of Spillway authority would transfer to the HOA. They'd finally have complete control over Pine Valley's water management, and my mother would spend her remaining years in some sterile facility while they turned our family land into luxury vacation rentals. That's when my water rights attorney delivered news that changed the entire game. The legal research revealed something beautiful. Not only did my family retain exclusive spillway control, but the board's luxury homes had been built using falsified elevation certificates. Every single lakefront mansion sat in the original flood easement zone, protected only by forged documents that claimed higher elevation than reality. "Your water rights are absolutely ironclad," my attorney explained, spreading surveyor maps across my kitchen table while spring sunshine melted snow outside. "But here's the interesting part. Their flood insurance is completely invalid." "How invalid?" "Like, their policies would be canceled immediately if insurance companies knew the real elevation data." The mini twist was discovering that Douglas Whitfield, our secretary and vacation rental king, used to work as an insurance adjuster before moving to Pine Valley. He knew exactly how to falsify elevation certificates, and he'd helped all 4 board members commit insurance fraud to build their illegal lakefront properties. But insurance fraud was just the beginning. My attorney's investigation revealed that their homes technically didn't exist in any legal sense. The construction permits were based on falsified surveys, the flood insurance was based on fabricated elevations, and the property taxes were based on incorrect zoning classifications. Spring snowpack data told a story that made me smile every time I checked the weather reports. Colorado was experiencing a record winter, with snow accumulation 40% above normal. When that snow melted during the traditional March warm-up, the volume of water flowing through Pine Valley would be unprecedented. Flood easement law is brutally simple once you understand the basics. Original drainage rights supersede all subsequent construction, regardless of property value. Translation: if someone builds expensive houses in your family's historic flood zone, that's their problem, not yours. I spent early March documenting baseline conditions, taking photographs of lake levels and spillway settings that would justify everything I was about to do. 40 years of maintenance logs showed consistent spring drainage operations during heavy snowmelt years. This wouldn't be revenge, this would be responsible water management. The weather forecast for mid-March predicted a 3-day heat wave with temperatures reaching 72 degrees. After the coldest winter on record, that kind of rapid warming would trigger massive snowpack melt across the entire mountain range. The spillway system was designed to handle exactly these conditions, with manual controls that allowed precise water flow management. My mother's stress increased as the court date approached, but I noticed she'd started asking fewer questions about strangers taking our house. Some part of her mind understood that I had a plan, even if she couldn't grasp the details. Trust built over 5 decades of care doesn't disappear just because memory fades. I tested the Spillway hydraulic controls one final time, listening to the satisfying hum of machinery that had served my family faithfully for 4 decades. Everything was ready. The only question was whether Cheryl and her board would provide the perfect timing I needed. As it turned out, their arrogance made the timing absolutely perfect. The breakthrough came from the most unexpected source: Douglas Whitfield's own files, discovered during my attorney's investigation into their shell company operations. Turns out that when you're running a systematic real estate fraud operation, you keep detailed records. And when those records end up as evidence in a federal investigation, they tell a story that's absolutely damning. Pine Valley Properties, LLC wasn't just buying distressed properties. They were creating the distress. For 3 years, the board had been implementing what their internal documents called strategic resident management, a clinical term for destroying people's lives to steal their land at below-market prices. The operation was sophisticated enough to impress a corporate raider. First, identify vulnerable residents: elderly, disabled, financially stressed, or socially isolated. Second, manufacture violations using selective enforcement of HOA rules that board members routinely ignored for themselves. Third, escalate pressure through coordinated agency complaints, social isolation, and financial penalties. Finally, offer generous buyout terms that seemed reasonable to people facing bankruptcy and community exile. 6 families had been processed through this system, generating over $2 million in profit for the board members. My mother and I were just the latest targets in an ongoing criminal enterprise that had been perfecting its methods for years. But here's where their sophisticated planning hit a wall they never saw coming. The legal discovery process revealed that every single luxury home owned by board members violated the original 1962 flood easement agreement. When my grandfather sold land for Pine Valley Development, he retained specific water rights that created a permanent flood zone along the original creek bed. Houses could be built in that zone, but only at elevations that wouldn't interfere with emergency drainage operations. Douglas Whitfield's insurance background made him the perfect accomplice for elevation certificate fraud. He knew exactly which documents to falsify and which officials to bribe to get lakefront building permits that should never have been issued. The result was 4 luxury homes sitting directly in my family's historic flood drainage area, protected only by fraudulent paperwork. Here's what made this discovery absolutely perfect. The original easement agreement didn't just give my family spillway control. It granted emergency flood prevention authority that superseded all local building codes and insurance regulations. In plain English, I could legally flood their illegal houses anytime I determined that emergency drainage was necessary to prevent downstream damage. The power dynamic shifted completely. They thought they were forcing out a vulnerable elderly man and his disabled mother. Instead, they'd declared war on someone who controlled their entire artificial paradise with the turn of a valve. Spring melt calculations told the rest of the story. Record snowpack plus spillway release during peak melt conditions would generate approximately 30 inches of water in their basement entertainment areas. Trevor's $180,000 home theater would become an indoor pool. Cheryl's $85,000 wine collection would float like corks in muddy mountain water. Marissa's luxury spa complex would overflow with snowmelt that had been accumulating all winter just for this moment. But the most beautiful discovery was learning about their Hawaii escape plans. While they were lecturing me about community safety and emergency preparedness, they'd been planning to abandon Pine Valley entirely during the months when emergency preparedness actually mattered. Their luxury homes sat empty through the harshest weather, maintained by automated systems while year-round residents faced isolation and danger. The emotional turning point wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about justice for Mrs. Patterson, who'd lost her diabetic supplies and been forced from her home. Justice for Mr. Rodriguez, whose wood-burning stove violations were manufactured by people who heated swimming pools all winter. Justice for every vulnerable resident who'd been systematically destroyed by criminals wearing HOA badges. My mother's suffering through that harsh winter wasn't just personal tragedy. It was evidence of a criminal conspiracy that had been destroying lives for years. Her confusion about missing medicine boxes represented the human cost of systematic elder abuse disguised as community management. The March 15th court hearing would determine whether they succeeded in stealing our land like they'd stolen from 6 other families. But what they didn't know was that March 15th also marked the beginning of peak snowmelt season, when responsible spillway management required immediate attention from someone who'd been doing the job for 40 years. I had the legal authority, the weather conditions, and the moral justification to turn their luxury paradise into a very expensive lesson about respecting property rights and treating vulnerable people with basic human dignity. All I needed was the perfect moment to remind them that sometimes the mountains have their own way of delivering justice. 40 years of spillway management taught me that timing is everything when you're dealing with mountain water. Too early, and you're just making puddles. Too late, and you miss the opportunity entirely. But hit the perfect moment during peak snowmelt, and you can move enough water to reshape the landscape. I spent early March servicing the hydraulic systems with the same methodical care my grandfather taught me. These weren't fancy computer controls. This was Depression-era engineering built to last forever and operate in conditions that would destroy modern equipment. Steel gears, mechanical pumps, and manual override systems that could function even when the power grid failed. The spillway gate mechanism hadn't been fully opened in 15 years, but the monthly testing I'd done all winter confirmed everything was ready. My grandfather installed remote controls back in the 80s when his arthritis made daily trips to the spillway impossible. Those controls ran through buried cables to a panel in our basement where 4 generations of garrisons had managed spring flooding. Calculating water flow rates became my obsession. The lake held approximately 50 million gallons when full, and the spillway could release 2 million gallons per hour when completely open. But spring melt added volume faster than normal drainage could handle, creating the pressure needed for what I had planned. I mapped every board member's property with surveyor precision, using county records to determine exact elevations and basement depths. Trevor's home theater sat 18 inches below the projected flood level. Cheryl's wine cellar was 22 inches below optimal waterline. Marissa's spa complex would be completely submerged under 30 inches of muddy mountain snowmelt. But technical calculations were just part of the strategy. My water rights attorney filed a federal conspiracy lawsuit that would protect me legally while creating perfect cover for spillway operations. Emergency drainage protocols, established by 40 years of family management, gave me absolute authority during spring melt conditions. The coalition of previous victims provided moral support and legal documentation that transformed personal revenge into community justice. Mrs. Patterson flew in from Phoenix specifically to testify about losing her diabetic supplies. Mr. Rodriguez drove up from Colorado Springs with photographs of the wood-burning stove that had supposedly threatened community safety. Each story added weight to the federal case while building public sympathy for what was coming. County emergency management protocols required spillway operators to prevent downstream flooding during extreme weather conditions. The irony was perfect. I'd be flooding the board's homes to protect the legitimate residents downstream. Their illegal construction in the flood zone made them the hazard I was required to eliminate. Here's what most people don't understand about mountain hydrology. Spring snowmelt works like a giant savings account that pays out everything at once. All winter, snow accumulates interest in the form of additional precipitation. Come spring, thermal energy acts like a bank run, liquidating the entire account in 72 hours. When 40 years of snowpack meets poor drainage planning, expensive basements become indoor swimming pools faster than you can say flood insurance. Weather Service data confirmed what I'd been tracking all winter. March 15th through 17th would bring sustained temperatures above 70 degrees, triggering massive melt across the entire mountain range. The timing couldn't be more perfect, exactly when the court hearing was scheduled to determine whether they'd steal our land. I spent the final week testing backup systems and documenting baseline conditions. Photographs of normal lake levels, spillway settings, and weather conditions would justify everything that followed. This wasn't vandalism or revenge. This was 40 years of expertise managing natural drainage during extreme conditions. My mother sensed something was changing, asking fewer questions about the court hearing and showing more interest in her medications and daily routines. Some part of her mind understood that justice was coming even if dementia prevented her from grasping the details. The hydraulic pump hummed quietly in our basement, waiting for the moment when decades of preparation would finally pay off. Outside, spring sunshine worked steadily on record snowpack, building pressure that would reshape Pine Valley forever. February's board meeting minutes, obtained through my attorney's discovery process, revealed just how desperate Cheryl and company had become. With their Hawaii tans fading and mounting legal pressure from the federal conspiracy investigation, they'd decided to accelerate their timeline dramatically. The private investigator they'd hired to document my erratic behavior had backfired spectacularly. Instead of finding evidence of mental instability, he documented months of methodical, professional spillway maintenance that demonstrated competence and responsibility. His photographs showed me following proper safety protocols, maintaining detailed weather logs, and caring for equipment that most people couldn't even identify, much less operate correctly. But desperation makes people stupid, and stupid people make dangerous decisions. The emergency court petition filed in late February painted me as an increasingly unstable individual whose obsessive weather monitoring and property modifications pose imminent danger during spring melt season. They claimed my erratic behavior patterns and paranoid documentation activities indicated someone who might attempt sabotage or vandalism to avoid property seizure. The mini twist that sealed their fate came when the private investigator's report was submitted as evidence. Instead of supporting their claims, his documentation proved I was the most qualified spillway operator in the county, with 40 years of accident-free management and professional-level expertise in mountain hydrology. Your Honor, my attorney explained to the judge during preliminary hearings, Mr. Garrison's weather monitoring isn't obsessive, it's essential. His documentation isn't paranoid, it's responsible record-keeping required for safe spillway operation. And his property modifications aren't erratic. They're maintenance activities that have prevented flooding disasters for 4 decades. The judge's questions revealed someone who understood mountain water management better than the board had anticipated. Are you suggesting that Mr. Garrison poses a threat to community safety through competent spillway management? Cheryl's attorney tried to argue that my fixation on spring flooding scenarios demonstrated unstable thinking, but the judge cut him off. Counselor, anyone who manages mountain drainage and doesn't monitor spring flooding scenarios is the one with unstable thinking. But while they were failing in court, I was tracking weather patterns that made my grandfather's drought stories seem like gentle summer rain. The National Weather Service confirmed what local conditions had been suggesting for weeks. Colorado was experiencing the most severe snowpack accumulation in recorded history. By early March, snowfall totals exceeded average years by 60%. The mountain peaks around Pine Valley looked like frosted wedding cakes, beautiful and terrifyingly loaded with potential energy that would transform into kinetic force the moment temperatures rose above freezing for more than a few hours. I maintained detailed logs of every weather reading, not just for legal protection, but because genuine spillway management requires precision timing. Release water too early during snowmelt, and you waste the opportunity. Release it too late, and natural flow overwhelms your control anyway. But hit the perfect moment when accumulated snowpack meets rapid warming and you can move enough water to carve new creek beds. The board's Hawaii vacation receipts, discovered during financial disclosure, showed they'd spent March planning to avoid the very conditions that made spillway management most critical. While I was calculating flow rates and preparing emergency drainage protocols, they were shopping for luxury beachwear and booking sunset dinner cruises. Their complete disconnection from Pine Valley's seasonal realities became evidence of their unfitness to control community water management. How could people who abandoned the mountains during spring melt possibly understand the responsibility of managing mountain drainage? The private investigator, ironically named in court documents as a character witness for my competence, had documented something beautiful. Every day for 3 months, I'd checked spillway conditions, recorded weather data, and maintained equipment with the methodical care of someone who understood that lives depended on proper water management. Meanwhile, their luxury homes sat empty through the harshest weather, with minimal heating systems cycling on and off to prevent pipe damage, while basement entertainment systems worth hundreds of thousands of dollars sat unprotected below the flood line they'd forgotten about when falsifying elevation certificates. County emergency protocols required spillway operators to begin active monitoring when snowpack exceeded normal levels by 20%. We were approaching 3 times normal accumulation, with weather conditions that would trigger mandatory drainage operations regardless of any personal considerations. My mother's condition had stabilized as spring approached, but she maintained her routine of asking about weather conditions and spillway status. 50 years of mountain living taught her to recognize signs that most people miss. She might not remember yesterday's conversation, but she knew when spring melt was building towards something significant. The court hearing scheduled for March 15th would determine whether criminal conspirators succeeded in stealing our family land. But March 15th was also predicted to be the first day of the spring heat wave that would trigger the largest snowmelt event in Pine Valley's recorded history. The final week before the court hearing brought weather conditions that seemed designed by nature specifically for what I had planned. 3 days of sustained 70-degree temperatures would trigger snowmelt that exceeded anything in 40 years of spillway records, creating perfect cover for emergency drainage operations that just happened to target properties built illegally in the flood zone. Cheryl's desperation peaked when she realized their legal strategy was collapsing. The private investigators' evidence supported my competence, the federal conspiracy charges were gaining momentum, and even their pet judge seemed skeptical about emergency property seizure. So they decided to manufacture one final crisis that would justify immediate action. March 10th brought sheriff's deputies to our door with a temporary restraining order that prohibited me from interfering with spillway operations during the pendency of property transfer proceedings. Translation: they were trying to prevent me from managing spring melt until after they'd stolen legal control of the water rights. The restraining order backfired immediately when the county water authority pointed out that preventing qualified spillway operation during peak melt conditions would endanger every downstream resident in Pine Valley. The judge who'd signed the order rescinded it within hours, noting that public safety supersedes property disputes. But the failed restraining order revealed their final strategy. Cheryl and the board planned to arrive at the March 15th hearing with media coverage, positioning themselves as concerned community leaders protecting residents from dangerous property owner. They'd invited Channel 7 News to document their community protection efforts and broadcast the hearing live. Perfect. They were providing witnesses for their own downfall. The mini twist that sealed everything came when the news investigators started researching the story independently. Instead of finding dangerous property owner threatening community safety, she discovered systematic elder abuse, real estate fraud, and insurance violations that made front-page news across Colorado. HOA board accused of elder abuse conspiracy ran as the lead story on March 12th, complete with interviews featuring Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Rodriguez, and the Williams family. Suddenly, the narrative shifted from dangerous hoarder to corrupt officials target vulnerable residents. The news coverage revealed something beautiful about community justice. People throughout Colorado had experienced similar HOA abuse, and my story became a symbol of resistance against petty tyrants who destroy lives for profit. The comment sections filled with support and similar stories that made it clear this was about much more than one family's property rights. March 13th brought the weather conditions I'd been tracking all winter. Overnight temperatures stayed above freezing for the first time since October, and daytime highs reached 68 degrees. Snowpack across the mountain range began releasing water faster than natural drainage could handle, exactly as 40 years of experience had taught me to expect. I began preliminary spillway operations according to established emergency protocols, opening gates to 20% capacity to manage initial melt flow. The basement control panel hummed quietly as hydraulic systems responded to remote commands, beginning the drainage process that would accelerate dramatically over the next 72 hours. The board's social media posts from their final Hawaii days provided perfect evidence of their disconnect from Pine Valley realities. Cheryl posted Sunset Beach photos on March 13th while I was beginning emergency water management operations to protect the community they'd abandoned. Trevor shared poolside cocktail videos while snowmelt threatened to overwhelm drainage systems he didn't understand existed. My mother spent those final days asking more coherent questions about weather and water conditions, as if approaching crisis had sharpened instincts that dementia couldn't entirely erode. "Is the spillway ready?" she'd ask, using terminology from 50 years of mountain living that transcended memory loss. "Everything's ready, Mom," I'd answer, checking hydraulic pressure readings that confirmed decades of maintenance were about to pay off spectacularly. The federal conspiracy investigation accelerated during those final days, with FBI agents interviewing victims and gathering evidence that would ensure prison sentences for the entire board. But federal justice moves slowly, and sometimes nature delivers consequences faster than courts can process paperwork. Channel 7 News confirmed they'd broadcast the March 15th hearing live, expecting to capture dramatic community confrontation between concerned officials and dangerous property owner. Instead, they document the moment when systematic elder abuse met consequences that 40 years of mountain water management made inevitable. Weather Service forecasts for March 15th predicted sustained 72-degree temperatures with clear skies, perfect conditions for rapid snowmelt that would require immediate spillway response according to emergency protocols established before any of these luxury homes existed. The only question remaining was whether Cheryl and her board would provide perfect timing for justice that looked exactly like responsible water management during extreme weather conditions. Based on 3 years of arrogant disregard for consequences, I was confident they'd deliver precisely the dramatic confrontation they'd been planning. March 15th dawned with crystalline mountain air and temperatures that promised to rewrite Pine Valley's history. By 7 a.m., the thermometer hit 65 degrees and climbing. Across the mountain range, 40 years' worth of accumulated snowpack began surrendering to spring sunshine with an urgency that made spillway management absolutely critical. The court hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the Pine Valley Community Center, conveniently located 50 yards from the lake that Cheryl and her board had forgotten was controlled by someone they'd been trying to destroy for 6 months. Channel 7 News arrived at 9:30 to set up for live coverage of what they expected to be a dramatic confrontation between concerned community leaders and a dangerous property owner. They got their dramatic confrontation, just not the way they'd planned. At 9:45, with media cameras rolling and 80 residents gathered to witness my supposed defeat, I activated full spillway release from the basement control panel in our house. 40 years of snowpack accumulation met emergency drainage protocols that had been protecting Pine Valley since before any luxury homes existed. The lake level dropped 18 inches in the first hour as 2 million gallons per hour poured through spillway gates designed to handle exactly these conditions. But spring snowmelt added water faster than normal drainage could manage, creating pressure that drove muddy mountain snowmelt directly into storm systems that fed the luxury lakefront properties. By 10:30 a.m., while Cheryl stood at the podium explaining why emergency property seizure was necessary to protect community safety, 30 inches of icy spring meltwater was flooding through her wine cellar, turning her $85,000 collection into floating corks in muddy mountain water. Trevor's $180,000 home theater became an indoor swimming pool where 75-inch televisions floated like massive black rectangles while leather recliners bobbed in water that smelled like decades of decomposed mountain vegetation. His illegally heated pool overflowed as basement drainage systems backed up with water that had been accumulating all winter for exactly this moment. Marissa's luxury spa complex, with its underground hot tubs and sauna facilities, disappeared under snowmelt that transformed $220,000 worth of relaxation equipment into expensive underwater sculptures. The backup heating systems she'd illegally installed without permits sparked and died as electrical circuits surrendered to natural forces that didn't care about property values. Douglas's vacation rental basement, where he stored furniture and equipment worth over $150,000, became a muddy lake that erased 3 years of illegal profits in less than 90 minutes. Pool tables floated like rafts while exercise equipment vanished beneath water that represented justice for every elderly resident he'd helped destroy. But the most beautiful moment came when all 4 board members received simultaneous phone calls about flooding emergencies at their properties. I watched Cheryl's face transform from fake concern to genuine panic as she realized her wine cellar was underwater. Trevor dropped his legal documents and ran toward his car when contractors called about his floating BMW in the garage. "You did this deliberately!" Cheryl screamed, pointing at me while standing knee-deep in muddy water that had risen around the community center as storm drains backed up with spillway overflow. I held up 40 years of spillway operation logs and smiled at the news cameras that were capturing everything in high definition. "Just following standard spring melt protocols, ma'am. Emergency drainage operations to prevent downstream flooding, exactly like my grandfather did and his grandfather before him." The mic drop moment came when I presented documentation to the assembled crowd and media. Maybe next time, read your property disclosures before building illegal houses in flood zones. Insurance investigators arrived within hours, followed by federal agents who'd been building the conspiracy case. The news crews captured everything, luxury cars floating in driveways, basement entertainment systems sparkling underwater, board members wading through muddy snowmelt while trying to save property that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Channel 7's live coverage went viral within minutes, with social media users sharing footage of justice delivered through mountain water management. Comments poured in from people who'd faced similar HOA abuse, celebrating the moment when petty tyrants faced consequences that 40 years of expertise made inevitable. County officials confirmed that spillway operations followed proper emergency protocols for extreme snowmelt conditions. The Water Authority praised responsible drainage management that had prevented downstream flooding exactly as designed. Even the fire marshal noted that emergency water management had eliminated fire hazards from illegal propane installations. By sunset, the board's luxury homes showed permanent watermarks at the 30-inch level, evidence of the day when systematic elder abuse met mountain justice delivered through natural forces and 40 years of patient preparation. The aftermath of March 15th unfolded exactly like mountain justice should, swiftly, completely, and with consequences that matched the crimes perfectly. Emergency responders confirmed that spillway operations had followed every proper protocol for extreme snowmelt management, protecting downstream residents exactly as emergency plans required. Insurance companies took one look at the falsified elevation certificates and denied every flood claim, leaving the board facing $2.8 million in uninsured property damage. 40 years of fraudulent documentation couldn't survive one day of honest water management, and their luxury paradise disappeared beneath mountain snowmelt that revealed the truth about illegal construction in protected flood zones. Federal prosecutors moved faster than anyone expected, filing criminal conspiracy charges against all 4 board members within a week. The evidence was overwhelming. Systematic targeting of elderly residents, real estate fraud through Pine Valley Properties LLC, insurance fraud through falsified elevation certificates, and elder abuse that constituted federal civil rights violations. Cheryl Kensington pleaded guilty to conspiracy and elder abuse charges, receiving 3 years in federal prison plus restitution requirements that would consume her wealth for the rest of her life. Trevor Ashworth faced additional insurance fraud charges when investigators discovered he'd been falsifying elevation certificates throughout the county, not just in Pine Valley. Marissa Vale's development company collapsed under federal investigation, and Douglas Whitfield lost his real estate license along with properties that were illegally constructed in protected zones. My federal lawsuit against the conspiracy settled for $850,000, with additional restitution from the board's shell company bringing the total to over $1 million in compensation for destroying our winter stockpile and traumatizing an elderly woman with dementia. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was watching 6 families who'd been forced from their homes receive justice through successful civil lawsuits. Mrs. Patterson recovered enough compensation to buy a new house in a community where medical supplies are respected rather than destroyed. Mr. Rodriguez got his wood-burning stove back, along with damages that helped his family rebuild their mountain retirement. The corrupt HOA dissolved completely, replaced by a resident council that includes mandatory representation for elderly and disabled community members. Property values actually increased once the artificial manipulation ended, and Pine Valley became known for supporting vulnerable residents rather than targeting them. I established the Mountain Winter Preparedness Fund using settlement money, creating emergency stockpiles for elderly residents who can't afford 6 months of supplies. The fund provides medical equipment loans, transportation during storms, and legal aid for anyone facing HOA abuse. My mother's suffering became the foundation for protecting other families from similar trauma. The community transformed in ways that surprised everyone. Neighbors who'd shunned us during the harassment campaign apologized and pitched in to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by systematic manipulation. The isolation tactics that seemed so effective in November became community-building opportunities by spring as people realized how easily they'd been turned against longtime friends. My mother's condition actually improved once security was restored and justice was served. Her routine stabilized, her stress levels decreased, and she stopped asking about lost medicine boxes once new supplies were properly organized in familiar containers. Dementia makes many things impossible, but it doesn't prevent someone from recognizing when their family is safe. The story gained national attention when investigative journalists discovered similar HOA corruption throughout Colorado and across the country. Legislative hearings resulted in new elder protection laws, mandatory transparency requirements for HOA finances, and criminal penalties for systematic harassment of vulnerable residents. Property rights research became a popular topic after news coverage showed how original landowner rights can supersede decades of subsequent development. People started checking water rights, easement agreements, and mineral rights that previous generations had negotiated, discovering leverage they'd never known existed. County courthouses reported increased visits from residents researching property histories that might contain forgotten protections. Flood zone regulations were strengthened after investigators discovered widespread elevation certificate fraud. Building permits now require independent verification, and insurance companies face criminal penalties for accepting falsified flood documentation. Douglas Whitfield's expertise in elevation fraud led to investigations throughout the state, revealing corruption that had enabled millions of dollars in illegal construction. Emergency preparedness education expanded beyond individual stockpiling to community-wide mutual aid networks. The Mountain Winter Preparedness Fund became a model for rural communities facing climate challenges, showing how collective resources can protect vulnerable residents more effectively than individual preparation alone. Spring melt in Pine Valley now follows natural patterns without interference from people who never understood mountain water management. The spillway operates according to 40 years of established protocols, protecting downstream residents while maintaining lake levels that support legitimate community needs rather than artificial luxury amenities. My mother and I sit on our porch most evenings now, watching sunset reflect off lake water that flows according to natural rhythms rather than corporate manipulation. She sometimes asks about the spillway, and I explain how it protects our community from people who don't understand that some things are more important than profit. But that's not the end of this story, because Cheryl's pharmaceutical connections ran deeper than anyone realized during the conspiracy investigation. Next week, I'll tell you about the corrupt city inspector who tried to condemn my mother's house for a medical waste facility, and why his own property ended up condemned instead when I discovered what was really buried under his luxury development project. Drop your worst HOA nightmare in the comments below. I read every single story, and some of these experiences are absolutely wild. The corruption we faced in Pine Valley happens everywhere, and sharing these stories helps people recognize the warning signs before systematic abuse destroys their lives. And if you want to see how corrupt officials get the consequences they deserve through patience, preparation, and understanding that justice sometimes flows like spring water, inevitable, powerful, and perfectly timed, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started with stories about what happens when people who abuse power meet folks who understand how the real world actually works.